Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Deception by Victoria Saccenti, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. October 2011, Afghanistan, North Helmand Province. Night was falling fast. 10 feet ahead, the jagged outcropping and dilapidated remains of an ancient stone wall made a weak outline against a darkening indigo sky. Sergeant Joe Reed held up his fist, and all movement behind him stopped. Satisfied with his squad's immediate response, he secured his M4 between his forearms and crawled forward the rest of the way. He reached the overhang, settled his carbine firmly on the dusty ground, and, peering through the scope, scanned the shallow valley below. The tiny village, the mission's objective, seemed deserted. There was no movement, no sign of life, least of all, Taliban combatants. Do we have bad intel? Frustration ran through him. The squad had marched 5 miles from the landing zone, had traversed near impossible terrain. Pre-skirmish adrenaline flooding their systems had pushed them onward. He couldn't imagine the operation turning out a total bust. An unseasonably cold wind blew from the mountain pass. Regardless of the chilly temperature, his body hummed with unspent tension. He knew his men felt it too. Going back to the exfil point empty-handed after a wasted mission was never a good feeling. Patience, he advised himself, looking up from the scope. He'll come when it's dark. As if someone had heard his thoughts, a faint amber point flickered through the window of a hut situated at the edge of the dirt road, the only flat access to the village. More lights appeared here and there. Joe blew out a hushed breath. Patience rewarded. Now that human activity had been confirmed, he slithered back to his squad. "All right," he whispered to the serious faces. "They're slowly coming in, but Zaman isn't here yet. He usually travels with 2 or 3 technical trucks, so we're going to sit tight and wait him out." Intent and focused, the men nodded. Well, everyone except his young buddy, Billy Dominski. The glazed miles-away look and the jittery behavior Billy had adopted since he'd read the latest letter from home hadn't waned. In fact, he'd become nearly morose. Jovial, easygoing Billy had disappeared. Joe pressed his lips together. He didn't like Billy's attitude one bit. It wasn't that he wasn't sympathetic. Bad news from home could break the most hardened Marine. In camp, he'd reached out to Billy repeatedly, but with each effort, the guy had withdrawn further in. In this critical moment, Joe didn't have time to pacify or hold anyone's hand. He needed his men ready. Combat didn't tolerate or forgive distractions. Absent-mindedness killed Marines. "Diaz," Joe extended 2 fingers. "You and Sanchez take a position at the bend. Signal when you see headlights." "Copy that, Sergeant." Diaz tapped his helmet, then scurried away with Sanchez in tow. "Stay frosty, guys." Propped on one knee, his carbine cradled in one arm, Joe glanced from face to face, reinforcing the seriousness of his words. "Zaman is our target, but he's cagey and spooks easily. That's why he's still around." He paused after a long breath, mentally recounting the high number of casualties at Zaman's hands. "We descend to the midpoint as planned and hold. If we remain unseen, we circle the village in stages. Remember the lookouts." Joe smirked. "Thing is, we're so far up north, they're expecting incursions from rival tribes. Not us. Nevertheless, these fighters are ruthless and shrewd, so no heroics. Stay with your team. We do this by the numbers. I want Zaman's men neutralized and their trucks disabled before he realizes he can't escape. Plus, he's got information command wants. If possible, we need to bring him back alive. Is that clear?" The group nodded in sync. "Okay, you have your assignments. Spread out. Cooper, Dominski, a word?" Billy stiffened, a deep questioning frown carving his forehead. Joe thought he would speak or protest. He didn't. Good for him. Slight deviation. I'm leading your fire team. Joe narrowed his eyes, studying Billy's face. Oorah, Cooper whispered under his breath. Amused by Cooper's response, Joe smiled, then turned to Billy. Are you with us, Dominski? Joe frowned. Is there a problem? No, Billy murmured, averting his eyes. What's this? 1,000,000 alarm bells rang in Joe's ears. Hey, Billy, look at me. I want a decisive answer. Yes, Sergeant, he said, closing off his expression. Present and ready. You'd better be, Joe whispered, subduing the rising dread. Something was definitely off, and his intuition kept poking him between his shoulder blades. Because we need you. I need you. The success of this op rests on every man's shoulders, awake and pulling their load. Understand? Jesus, yes, Sergeant, I understand. Billy shook his head, eyes fixed on the gravelly soil below his knees. 2 stubborn lines appeared between his eyebrows, marking the end of the conversation. Damn it, the kid had clamped up. He'd been pushed far enough. Okay, follow me, Joe said, scrambling toward the rocky overhang. He settled at the edge as the 2 men dropped next to him. In the moonless night, he could barely see his gloved hand. The valley and mud huts would have also disappeared in the inky blackness, except that the smattering of amber pinpoints, which Joe assumed were candles, nullified that effect with the power of runway lights. He smirked at Zaman's outright arrogance. Not exactly the best precautions to stay hidden. Then again, the drug lord didn't grasp the Marine's resolve or imagine that he'd been chased this far north. No one had been before. Minutes ticked by in silence. Despite the chilly temperature, Joe's scalp heated under the helmet and nervous sweat ran down the back of his neck. His left forearm started cramping. He slowly rolled his shoulders as he clenched and released his fist, encouraging the flow of circulation. Cooper exhaled a long, muffled sigh. Billy didn't move or breathe. Joe began evaluating if that was a good thing or not when white beams, followed by the distant roar of engines approaching from the northwest, got his attention. As he'd suspected, Zaman had waited until after nightfall to return home. Diaz turned his flashlight on and off. The headlights dipped and rose along the hilly road, growing brighter and bolder in an obvious announcement. Let the villagers make ready for Zaman's arrival. Joe suppressed a snort. Here was a true narcissist. So much for discretion. 3 technicals screeched into the village and veered to the left behind one of the huts. The sounds of engines ceased and the lights turned off. The occupants must have gone inside through a back door because no one came around the front. Joe waited another 10 minutes, giving this latest group time to settle down, get comfortable in their false security. He flipped his night vision goggles down. The landscape turned eerily green. Ready to engage, he circled his index finger in the air. Silently, the squad inched forward. The teams made it halfway down the slope. As he'd instructed, everyone flattened against the ground, preparing for possible discovery. At this distance, the village dogs, sentries impossible to fool, could easily sniff their scent. Most Taliban drug lords used them without fail. Did Zaman? He didn't. Not a single suspicious growl or bark raised the alarm. Joe signaled again, and the circle of men widened, entering the village from several directions. In a tactical crouch, Joe passed under the window. Inside, a woman holding a lit candle walked across the floor. She didn't see him. The large shadows the soft flame cast camouflaged him. Barely breathing, he moved on. He peeked around the edge of her hut. The blurry glint of a cigarette tip moving erratically up and down betrayed a careless sentinel. Knife in hand, Joe slipped behind him. Muffling the guard's surprised exclamation with his palm, he sliced the man's throat in one move. Joe steadied the lookout in a tight embrace as his gurgles ceased and his struggling spasms subsided, then placed him silently on the ground and slipped on to the next structure. Fuck, another pair of gloves ruined. He shook off the dispassionate thought. He'd been out here too long. He needed to go home. spend quality time in civilization before he lost the last traces of humanity, before the combat beast took over. Get your head back in play, he reminded himself as he went past another hut. And where the hell are Billy and Cooper? They'd gone their own way while he dealt with the guard. Joe fumed with anger. As soon as the squad was picked up, Billy was going to get an earful from him. Bad news from home or not, Joe couldn't tolerate disobedience. No more coddling. He cleared the narrow gap between homes and ran into Brant and Ronan as the team dispatched another sentinel. Joe could only hope Billy and Cooper, wherever the fuck they were, followed the plan, neutralizing Zaman's men. Joe was preparing to cross the main road when a woman's screech and a deafening barrage of muzzle blasts shattered the silence. 2 powerful beams of light turned night into day. Shit, a 4th technical? Joe bolted. At the edge of the road, he stopped dead as his stunned brain processed the scene. Cooper lay splayed face down on the dirt. Arms raised, Billy walked and yelled toward the truck. Look at me. I'm right here. Zaman stood in the technical, handling a PK machine gun. He sneered, aiming at Billy. No! Joe hollered. For a brief, horrific second, an incongruous span of time, slow-moving and eternal, Zaman glared at Joe, then turned to Billy and opened fire. Riddled with bullets, arms flailing, Billy pirouetted in a grotesque dance and flopped down. Joe and his squad returned fire. Zaman collapsed into his truck. His driver reversed the vehicle with a jerk, clearing the way for Zaman's screaming fighters. Ignoring the shots peppering the ground around him and the insane cacophony of automatic fire, Joe sprinted to his friend. Billy! Billy! He shook the young man's shoulder. Billy couldn't speak anymore. Desperate, Joe pulled his buddy's inert, bloodied form, dragged him toward the nearest hut, sinking shelter. RPG! Brant screamed. Joe looked up. On the road, the fighter aimed his launcher. The rocket flew. The hut exploded. 1,000 blades slashed Joe's face and body. Darkness took him.